Hi, everyone. No fun intro this week. Instead, I want to talk about something serious for a moment. I want to share a detail about this show that I'm not proud of. According to our analytics, roughly 94% of our listeners are men. And that's at least partially why, even though this is a podcast about magic and not news or politics or healthcare, Anthony and I feel it's important to say that we are disgusted and outraged by the U.S. Supreme Court's recent decision to overturn Roe v. Wade and end the federal right to abortion in the United States. Abortion is essential health care, and the right to bodily autonomy is fundamental to a free society. I wish I knew what to do, but the truth is that the Supreme Court is an anti-democratic institution that we, the people, have no formal influence over. In the absence of a clear way to create systemic change, consider donating to your local abortion fund if you're so inclined. And to the 94% of men listening, be outraged. Listen to what women and other people whose health and well-being is directly threatened by this ruling have to say. I've included some links in the show notes for places to donate, and to all of our non-US listeners, I am sorry for the interruption, but the American experiment just continues to unravel before our eyes in new and horrifying ways, and it feels disingenuous not to at least acknowledge it. On to the show. And on that bombshell, welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy. I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony, expert at making cuts in drywall-matics.
I would say I am have done it now.
That was a nice bait and switch, you
Sometimes.
see. They saw the podcast title. They thought I was talking about Cube, but actually I'm talking about drywall because you're helping me work on a little house project.
We're pivoting the podcast yet again to be drywall talk.
This house project actually does have a little bit of bearing on Lucky Paper listeners, but they're going to have to wait to see how it matters to them.
I would say it's a load-bearing project.
Definitely not. The city asks, it's not a load-bearing project. There's no load being bared, I swear. Zero load at all. On this week's podcast, we are going to be talking about how to make cuts from your cube list. I think this is probably the least fun part of cube design for most people. Would you agree, Anthony?
That's a difficult question for me because I feel like in a lot of ways it is cube design. Like choosing what you put in and what you take out are kind of just the same
those
question,
are the two
right?
halves. The
Those are
putting
the two
in is
halves.
fun and the taking out is not fun. Everyone agrees on this.
Yes, from that perspective, I can see where you're coming from.
I think we've actually spent a lot of time talking about, maybe a little bit obliquely, what kinds of cards to add. Our main advice for new cube designers is any card you like. Just put cards you like in. But how do you decide what cards to cut when you have a pile of cards you like left behind? So that's what we're covering in this week's episode. Before we do that, though, we are going to do a pack one, pick one from a listener-submitted cube. This week's cube comes to us from listener Arlo, and she has a budget-minded cube that she says started as the Card Kingdom starter cube, but in true Cube of Theseus fashion, basically no longer contains any cards that were in the original Card Kingdom starter cube, and now is a design of her own making.
That's awesome just to see like such a clear success story from that cube. Like I feel like that is common advice that's given, and that's really what those cubes are there for. It's just
Right.
like, hey, if you want to have a cube but it is intimidating to start with a whole list, just buy this. It's ready to go when it's done, and then make it your own slowly, based on actual play experience. And it's cool that has happened at least one time. I'm sure it's happened. It happens all the time, but
Maybe a little peek behind the curtain, but we've been talking a little bit, just casually, about would it be possible to make some kind of survey we could pose to visitors to the website, and they could answer some questions, say what kind of cards they like, and have it like build a customized cube list for them. And in our discussion, we were like, what it could do? It could kind of be like almost entirely random. And like the whole point is just that you get a starting place and the confidence to go in and start making cuts and additions based on their own preferences. Those cubes serve as a much better way to do that than a random list of cards.
the random list of cards is kind of interesting, though. I'm just thinking about like what initial sort of seed crystals would bump you into like a different local maximum of evolving your cube, where you with the very same taste in cards, starting with a random list and just making incremental changes, you might just end up in different places based on that starting point. And I'd be really, I want to think about that more.
All right.
Okay.
You're welcome to think about that more, and please let us know
I'll do that on my own time.
when you have any wisdom to share related to that topic. Anyway, back to Arlo's Cube. I'm going to read the pack. Anthony is going to tell us what he is thinking about taking pack one, pick one. The pack is Isamaru, Hound of Khanda, Smell Fear, Iron Apprentice, Preordain, Kessig, Flame Breather, Sun Titan, Lingering Souls, Torch Fiend, Terramorphic Expanse, Witch's Cauldron, Geist Honored Monk, Jaya's Greeting, Negate, Soul Herder, and Anti-Cognition. Got a mixture of what I would say are some pretty common cube cards here, Anthony, with some cards I'd never seen before and had to read the rules text to. What are you taking out of this pack?
So I often say this is a really difficult choice.
Yeah, pretty much every week you say that.
Pretty much. I think this is a pretty easy one for me. I think that there's a pretty... There are a couple good contenders, but as far as things I'm excited to take pack one, pick one, a couple really stand out, which are Sun Titan, Lingering Souls, and Soul Herder. Taking a look through this cube, I feel like it's maybe a little bit slower and doesn't have quite the density of mana fixing we have in a lot of environments, so that's pushing me away from some of these gold cards. I'm just taking Sun Titan here and being very happy about it. It's an extremely powerful card, it does a lot, and it's really fun to play with, to be honest.
I think Sun Titan is definitely in the top 2 best cards in the cube, but the other card I have identified is Preordain.
I'm not surprised.
I mean, that is definitely a preference thing. You know, I love taking cards I can cast that allow me to cast more cards by making sure I hit my land drops when I need them, or can get rid of spells that are no longer relevant at that stage of the game. This card definitely scales with power level, right? Like Preordain is a super high pick in my own cube, which is very high power level, where Sun Titan would be kind of unplayable. Here, I think it's about just as good relatively, not absolutely, and I think it's kind of on par with Sun Titan for me in terms of first pick ability. I agree that a gold card is not really what I want to start unless it's a really huge power outlier, and I look at Lingering Souls and Soul Herder, and those are not big enough power outliers for me to want to start there. The third card I'm looking at after Preordain and Sun Titan is actually Jaya's Greeting. I think efficient removal is always something I also like to prioritize, and this is the one that deals 3 damage to target creature. You get to scry 1 for 2 mana, instant speed. Gets the job done. I think maybe people are like, it's not Lightning Strike, it's not Lightning Bolt, but it's quality efficient removal that I'll be very happy to play. So those are the 2 cards I'm looking at, and I'm just going to take the Preordain, I think. And I can definitely be sold on the fact that Sun Titan is the correct pick, but I feel like I'm going to see more Sun Titan-esque cards in later packs and wish I had taken the card that makes my deck work early.
I mean, just look through the list. I don't think there's a lot of other things that are, especially like a lot of other 6 or 7 drops that are going to have that kind of power level. So I think
you can just win the game with a 4 drop, though.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair.
That's what I like to do. Win the game with a 4 drop is my favorite thing to do.
The other thing I do wonder if it's worth more consideration is Terramorphic Expanse, just because I think fixing is going to be very important here, and that's powerful fixing in a lot of contexts.
I could see that, yeah. The budget consideration here, which I think every card here is under $5, or at least was when it was added to the cube, that certainly rules out the most expensive lands. We have a total of 12 fixing lands in the cube, and yeah, I can honestly see that being a decent choice, especially because I think starting with Preordain or Sun Titan, neither of us are probably aiming to be a monocolored deck. A mono blue can be tricky to make work, though looking at this list, I think there's definitely things that can make it come together. And then mono white topping out at a 6 drop with no way to ramp into it or like cantrip into the lands you need to cast it. Maybe a little bit questionable. I'm seeing plenty of things here that I think are solid win conditions in the ilk of Sun Titan. So I'm still confident in my Preordain pick. Though Terramorphic Expanse, given the low amount of fixing lands in this cube, honestly could just be the pick and just, kind of delay that pack 1 pick 1 decision until pack 2.
I know it's never happening, but what I really want to do is take Sun Titan and then wheel Terramorphic Expanse.
Yeah, I think you have a better chance of doing the opposite, and you don't have a good chance of doing that either.
Fair enough.
I want to take Preordain and wield Jaya's Greeting, which I also don't think is possible, but...
I really like Jaya's Greeting. 3 damage plus a scry 1 is just such a nice little package. I don't know why I don't put this in more cubes.
This feels like a good regular cube style card and power level card.
Yeah, maybe I'll give that another thought.
I do like having just like incidental scry on bread and butter effects like that. I'm going to want at in almost any game, especially in the cube like this, I'm going to want a 3 damage burn spell on creatures. So the fact that this is going to be something I'm going to want to cast as early as makes sense to, and just get that scry to keep the deck churning and hitting on all cylinders is exactly what I'm looking to do.
Absolutely.
So you're on Sun Titan, maybe the correct pick. I'm on Preordain, definitely a biased pick for the things I like to do in Magic, which is draw cards and cast Preordain. I got to do a little shout out to Anti-Cognition here, which is a relatively recent card I had actually not seen before. This one's from Zendikar Rising. It's basically a quench for creatures or planeswalkers, and then if the counterspell resolves, I mean, it actually counters the spell your opponent was trying to cast, then you get to scry 2. I would definitely like it more if you just always got to scry 2, so worst case scenario, you could just kind of cycle this even when your opponent had mana to pay for it, and obviously would. But again, a sort of quench style counter spell with scry 2 to staple to it, that is, I think, a reasonable wheel to hope for Pack One Pick winning this preordained. So maybe I'll hope that anti-cognition comes back around. All right, thank you, Arlo, for sending in your pack and your kind words about the podcast. I'm glad we could help you get deep into cube design, and this Card Kingdom Starter Cube is a good place for you to get started. If you want to have a pack from your cube dissected live on air, I guess it's not live. This is pre-recorded. If you want to have a pack from your cube dissected pre-recorded on air by Anthony and I, send it into mail@luckypaper.co with your name and pronouns, and we'll do it on the show. We've independently made notes about tips for making cuts. And after making my notes, I feel compelled to start with some don'ts around making cuts that I think are, for many cube designers, kind of assumptions about how cuts have to be made. Does that seem like a reasonable place to start to you, or do you ever start somewhere else?
No, let's start there.
I think people labor over cuts too much as cube designers, and I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, and this is maybe the most important one, it's the most simple, people feel like cutting a card from their cube is a huge decision that you can't go back from. And obviously you can. You can just put the card back in. So overall, my number one tip for making cuts is don't sweat it that much. Just cut a card. If you miss it, you can always put it back. I've had my cube for 5 or 6 years now, and I've cut and put cards back in many, many times. Some specific cards have been in and out of the cube 5 or 6 times through the entire lifetime of the cube, and there's no reason you can't or shouldn't do that. Cutting a card is not some ultimatum of that card being awful and you're never coming back to it.
Yeah, I think this is a great point, and I do the same thing. When I cut cards, I generally don't put them right back into the collection, or I don't necessarily buy list them or whatever right away, or ever.
Yeah, you never buy list of cards.
Just put them back in the box. But yeah, just keep them on hand, because I mean, if you're thinking, here's this card that was one of the cards that was considered for contention in this cube, it was really close on the edge. Just because you're cutting it doesn't mean it's now way far away from your goals. It's just off the edge a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So your preferences, your taste, your goals might change a little bit, and that card might still be relevant.
Yeah, a lot of times I have cut something, it has been brought back in 3, 6, 9 months later because the cube has actually changed enough that the card is different now. It performs differently. So even if it was the correct cut for my design goals at the time, it's now correct to add it back in based on my updated design goals. So that can definitely happen. That's my first tip. It's just don't sweat it that much, because it sounds very final to say it's cut from the cube, but just put it back in if you miss it. It's not a huge deal.
Right. And I think there's sort of 2 aspects of this. One is make your cuts freely. Don't put too much of a burden on yourself on that decision. And also just be willing to make cuts pretty often, because it is easy and it's not permanent, and you can always change stuff again.
Yes, it's much easier to get in the habit of just changing your cube whenever you feel like it. And, if you put a burden on yourself about writing blog posts and explaining your reasoning on Cube Cobra or something, that will definitely slow you down. But so if you're not worried about doing that, just, cut cards whenever you feel like it.
Another small distinction we've sort of said in kind of a joking, ironic way, oh, we're banning a card from a cube. And that, I think, is there. This is a space where I think there is kind of a meaningful distinction between saying, I'm cutting this card, but, I still like it. There's still a chance it could make it back in.
Thassa's Oracle was banned from the Turbo
Thassa's
Cube.
Oracle was banned from the Turbo Cube because it was literally degenerate. If you drafted a 2-card combo, you would win on turn 2 deterministically. That's the situation. And there are less extreme situations where you still want to say, this clearly is a card that is not appropriate for this based on some particular play experience.
Which is maybe helpful for just how you rationalize and think about the cuts in your own head, but also communicating to your playgroup, right? When you say this card is banned, they know to never ask if it's coming back, right? Thassa's Oracle is gone, it's never coming back. When you make a cut or 2, those cards could always see play again, and so there's a distinction there.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next thing I observe a lot of people doing that I think makes cuts a lot harder is a lot of people still maintain very fixed sizes of color sections. They want everything to be symmetrical, exactly 50 of each color, exactly 2 gold cards in each gold card slot. And so when you have a new addition to make, you have to make a cut from a particular section of your cube. You're narrowing down the range of things you're willing to make cuts from, which I think is really tying your hands in terms of making the right decisions for your cube. We've talked a lot on here about how the symmetry between colors is really a purely aesthetic thing, and except for extreme cases where you have 4 times as many cards in one color as another, it's almost never going to be felt by your drafters. And so it's much easier, I think, to avoid that pitfall and just cut card X, add card Y, even if they have no superficial traits in common.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And again, we're sort of talking about all the things that create friction to making changes and making cuts to the cube. And that's a big one. If you feel like, oh, I'm cutting my 4-mana blue planeswalker, I need to add another 4-mana blue planeswalker because that's the slot that I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
And, if you swap it for a 4-mana blue creature, it's going to be fairly similar. If you swap it for a 2-mana red spell, it's also not going to make that much of a difference.
And that's actually slightly even further down that road than I was suggesting. Like, there's one level of just, I want to maintain color parity. So if I cut a blue card, I got to add a blue card. There's the other level of this kind of assumption that your cube is perfect in terms of its like structure. And so you don't want to like cut a creature without putting in another creature with the exact same mana value. You don't want to go down a cantrip unless you put in another cantrip. Everyone's goals are personal, but I find it very difficult to believe that anybody out there has nailed their own design preferences so much that their cube is actually perfect in terms of the overall mana curve and spell types and like how everything's laid out. And these like for like cuts are important to maintaining the sort of integrity of the environment. I don't think that's possible.
I think my cube's perfect.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. I'm glad you have a podcast. You should tell everyone how to make a perfect cube then.
I just clone mine.
So yeah, I think those are two pitfalls. Is definitely don't constrain yourself to like cutting a similar card for the card you're adding in terms of card type, mana value, whatever. And also, I would say go a step further and don't even constrain yourself to the same color. Cut a burn spell, add a mana rock. Cut a mana dork, add a board wipe. Like, we'll get to how you decide positively, like what you should do to find cuts. But when you do find those cuts, don't worry about finding a card to add in that lines up with what that card was previously doing in your cube, because you haven't nailed it, right? And it's actually better, I think. Honestly, all things equal, I would argue that more players should experience their cube at different extremes, right? Like, what happens if you cut 10 creatures and add in 10 more spells? How different does it make the environment? There's going to be a lot of nuanced changes that are really difficult to predict, imagine, and understand how you're actually going to come down in terms of preferences until you've done it. So all things equal, I would say actually try and cut unlike cards so your cube changes more, so you learn more about the environment by playing it and testing.
Yeah, I could see some, in very specific context, some downsides to that. If you have a regular play group that's really interested in trying to learn about their play experience and fine-tune their play skills specifically, then having things change a lot could throw people off. But I don't see a lot of cube players sort of playing in that way. It's much more like about the design experience and the collaboration and exploration. So I think really what we want to get at is, obviously, if you swap a card for a similar card, you're doing a great. But if you're feeling this is a burden, there's like too much friction to actually making changes and you're slowing yourself down, that's a great thing that you can throw off and no longer hold yourself accountable to.
Yeah, absolutely. My last thing that I think a lot of people do that maybe they shouldn't is it's actually a little radical, Anthony, which is that if you're looking to make a cut, maybe don't. Cube size is not a fixed thing. You don't have to run a very specific number of cards. And a great way to see how a card performs in your environment without this burden of cutting something is just don't cut anything. Put the card in, play with it for a while, and if you get to a point where you want to make cuts, you can always do that. You live this philosophy more than I do. You actually have a cube that is a somewhat random size. How big is the regular cube right now? 411 cards, 413 cards around there?
Somewhere around there.
Yeah, and we take 360 of them every time, and so we're not getting quite the whole cube, but you're not running some even number or some multiple of 15. You're just playing cards, right? And that really takes a lot of pressure off you for finding cuts, because if you don't have a cut you want to make and you have a card you want to add, you just add it.
Yeah, I mean, it makes both additions and cuts totally easy, because like you're saying, if, maybe we've had a conversation about a card a couple times and it's maybe a little bit problematic, we can just take that out and that's fine. We don't need to find a replacement to keep the cube at a very fixed size. And same with additions. We're not required to make cuts if we want to expand and try new cards. Maybe it's good evidence that it's been a little bit too long since I've updated my cubes. And so I recognize that there is a lot of friction. So this is a lesson that I need to live, because I need to remove as much of those barriers as I can to update them even as often as I am doing. So yeah, I really value that.
I will say the flip side of that is, I give that advice. You don't have to make cuts if you don't want to. I myself do maintain cubes. All the cubes I've designed are at a fixed card size. And I find for me, it's really helpful to have that as a limiting factor that actually forces me to whittle things down and make tough decisions that I otherwise wouldn't make. And so there's definitely reasons to do one or the other, but I see way more people that are playing cubes at fixed sizes that maybe haven't even thought about the alternative. They assume you have to have a fixed size of cards. You have to have exactly 360 or 540 or whatever. So I think giving the advice that you don't have to. You can just add a card if you want, and now you have 361 or 365 or 411, and it's fine.
Yeah, I think actually another context where this is extremely relevant that I saw somebody asking, I think about on Reddit, was they were curious if they should start with just a 180 card cube for mostly 2 players, or if they should go for a full 360. And my advice was just, start with the small list, because that's all you need. And then you can just keep adding cards to it as you play it and you find other things you're interested in. You don't need to be like, now I'm making this monumentous shift and doubling the cube size.
Right.
Just add cards as you learn about that environment and figure out what's working there. And I honestly think that's a great way to start a cube, because it's easier to have a smaller list. And then, it's just fun to add things slowly.
Yeah, if you just doubled a cube size in one go, everything you learned about that previous environment is probably almost null and void. Like
it would be difficult to translate that information.
Right, you would have to do a lot of like, okay, I have 2 counter spells in my 180 list. I'm going to add 2 more counter spells at the same cost. You'd have to like try and actually add redundant effects to grow the cube larger to avoid dramatically reshaping the environment, which is not particularly fun. So I like that advice of start small and grow organically. Is there anything I missed in terms of common misconceptions around how you have to make cuts that hold people back?
Maybe this is getting into a different topic, but I feel like for a lot of people...
If you're going to get into a different topic, I have to play the stinger music.
For a lot of people, and I think this has changed in a big way, like we talked about a couple episodes ago, I think it has changed the way that the community talks about Cube, but for many people still, the way that you approach cuts is just cut the bad, quote-unquote bad cards, the cards that are less powerful, the cards that are less impactful. Is that a separate topic, or do you want to lump this into misconceptions?
I mean, who cares what the timestamps say? Let's just talk about that now, because that's on my list for sure.
So, I mean, I totally get this compulsion, and I think that it comes from many different contexts. It comes from the way that we evaluate cards as a player perspective when you're playing in Constructed or in Limited, and it comes from just the fact that as you're adding cards, you don't want to add... It's more exciting to add a powerful card that is going to be visible and impactful than to say, I'm going to add this card, which is a reasonable C- and is going to make somebody's deck occasionally. There are all these factors, but I do think that if we want to step back and think about how do I create the best gameplay, thinking about the cube as a whole, that sort of pattern of just saying, the way I'm going to make cuts is to cut the least powerful cards is not necessarily productive towards just creating the specific kind of gameplay you're looking for. What it is just driving you in one direction towards this ceiling of playing the most powerful cards.
Yeah, I think this is by far the biggest bias, and is something that I think is present to some degree in everybody's cube, right? Like, I try consciously to not just cut the cards that are the worst cards. What we mean here is just, the cards that are always in sideboards, that someone gets last pick, it's in their colorlist, but they're like, I'm never going to play this. The cards that, for all intents and purposes, kind of aren't even in your cube, right? Because if they're not seeing play, then they're not even really doing anything. And so there is certainly a big argument to cut those cards because, if they're not having an impact, then that's just free space for you to use for something else.
Yeah, I mean, in itself, that is a completely reasonable statement, and that makes a lot of sense.
I think that's what a lot of people think, right? They're like, well, these are the bad cards, so obviously I'll cut them and replace them with something else because who wants to play bad cards? But what you're getting at, Anthony, is, just to restate it, is that following that process, month over month, year over year for editing your cube of just continuing to cut the cards no one's playing and put in more cards, and then from this new modified pool of cards, cut the cards that no one's playing after that. It does trend towards this local maxima of making your cube a particular way, and you're giving up a lot of control as a cube designer when you do that. You're basically just saying, okay, well, I'm just going to follow the play patterns, right? Follow the cards that are successful in my environment, whatever that environment is, and just put in more of those kinds of things. If you find yourself cutting cards that aren't seeing play, that you want to be good, that are the kinds of cards that you want to be successful in your environment, that's a great case to, step back and reevaluate and start saying, maybe I should cut some of the cards off the top, actually, so that this card is no longer languishing in sideboards, but becomes a playable option because this is the actual spirit that I'm aiming for with this cube.
Yeah, and I think that the really important part to that is that it does depend on your motivation. If your motivation is just, I want to play the most powerful cards because they're splashy, they are aesthetically interesting, they are, familiar from Constructed, that's a totally valid way to pursue cube. But the other side is, like you're saying, you are giving up on some of that control of, you don't have quite the same knobs to say, I want to power this effect up just a little bit, and I have this big range of cards to be able to choose from. You're just a little bit more limited being against that ceiling. And like you're saying, you're also potentially giving up on the control of just, there might be individual cards that happen to not be that powerful or not that impactful that you would like to be. And you can still do that. It's just the strategy isn't just cut them.
Yeah. The other thing I think this comes from is that I think it feels a lot safer to cut the bad cards because if you have a cube and you played your cube, you probably had fun because cube drafting is fun. Magic is fun. So you like your cube. And as we said, the cards that are not seeing play are having a much smaller influence on that environment. It might feel somewhat risky to cut a powerful card because as we've established, the powerful cards are the ones that get drafted highly. They always make main decks. They get played because you keep a hand that has a powerful card in it. They're going to have the most impact on the games in your environment. And so cutting a card that you just saw someone win with a big smile on their face with, it can be difficult. Whereas cutting a card that no one was playing because it was languishing in a sideboard feels very safe. And so I think there's that element too, where people are like, okay, my cube is good. I like my cube. I'm just going to keep hewing it, right? Just like trimming off some of this chaff and trying to like, shape it to this like perfect thing. But the moments of real growth in my own cube design have for sure come from when I've cut from the top, where it's like, actually, you know what? These cards are not the kind of gameplay I want to go for anymore. And those are the moments where my cube has taken a harder turn. But because of those harder turns, I am much happier with where my cube is now than I would be if I hadn't made those decisions.
I just want to say, when you say someone has a huge smile on their face when they win with this card and it feels silly to cut it, look at their opponent's face as well and sort of get the whole picture.
It is important to get the whole picture. That's true. So I think that's another aspect to it, is that, people have this negative association with the bad cards. They didn't want to see them in a pack. They didn't want to put them in their deck. So, of course, you want to cut it from your cube, right? You're one of the players, too. If you didn't want to put that card in your deck, you're probably likely to want to take it out of the cube. But it also is this kind of safe cut where, it wasn't affecting anything because no one played it. So might as well just get it out of here and try and put something in here that will affect things. But I do think that cycle does kind of lead you down a particular path that, if you step back and really think about your cube design goals, your gameplay goals, might not be the path you want to go down. My next tip for finding cuts from your cube is to make cuts based on your high-level goals, not individual qualities of cards. I think people are often like, okay, let me shop through my whole list and find the card I like the least, or the card that is just not contributing to the games or whatever. They're looking for a specific card, when my recommendation is to think about what are your overall goals for your environment, and you might end up cutting a card that the individual card is a card you like, but you've got enough of them, and so this one is kind of superfluous, or the individual card supports a strategy you like, but that also kind of overlaps with the strategy you're actually trying to cut back on, and so you're trying to like narrow these things down. For me, personally, for my own cube design goals, this means that I'm always looking to cut high mana value cards. Even higher mana value cards that I love, I will cut a higher mana value card that I really like over a cheaper card that I don't like as much, because my overall goal for my environment for the past couple years has been to speed it up as much as possible and lower the curve as much as possible. So when I have a card to add, I'm not just looking for, okay, what's a card I don't like I can get rid of. I'm really looking at, all right, what are the 3, 4, 5 mana cards that are not necessary anymore, that maybe you don't need to win the game with. Maybe you're fine winning the game with the cheaper card.
I think this is a really good point and covers a lot of just the way you think about cube as a design exercise and as game design. It really is important that individual cards matter, but it is sort of the context and structure that matters even more to the kind of gameplay you're going to get at. And if you have one individual card that maybe is not quite where you want it to be, whether that's because of power level or because of particular play patterns or whatever, that'll have a small impact, but really it's the volume of a lot of these effects that really dictate the gameplay. So you could say, well, I have this one counterspell that's a little bit too efficient or overpowered. That's going to come up. That's going to matter in individual games on individual turns, but it's not going to shape the whole gameplay experience as much as saying, well, do I have 5 or 25 counterspells, which is so much more important.
And I think to get back to our earlier point, if you're just cutting bad cards and adding good cards, then you may find that your cube kind of hews towards whatever cards happen to be powerful that are printed, regardless of whether or not that's the density of that effect you want.
Absolutely.
So, for example, like I play a lot of cantrips that people would probably say are bad cards, right? I love Sleight of Hand. I love Serum Visions. These kind of, definitely, they're not in the top 7 cantrips in cube, right? Most people don't even run that many cantrips or whatever. So I run these cards that are like worse cards over 4-drop planeswalkers, people would say are like one of the best 4-drop planeswalkers ever, because I really like cantrips. I value that more than 4-mana planeswalkers. So that's the kind of decision making that goes into that.
Yeah, and you mentioned as well thinking about other sort of aspects of cards, whether that's particular effects like the volume of counterspells, the volume of removal, the volume of mana fixing that might drive you to add and cut cards. We can also think about just individual colors. Are you actually trying to balance the colors or imbalance them in particular ways? Are you trying to achieve a certain level of gold cards, or really critically a certain sort of distribution of mana costs?
Yeah. So I have an example here. I think examples are really helpful whenever we can give them. I am going to be cutting Batterskull from my cube, my next round of edits. And I probably would have said 2 years ago I would never cut Batterskull because it's a card I individually love. I think Batterskull is such a cool card. I love the original art. I love the interaction with Stoneforge Mystic, where you can, basically tutor up a creature and play this creature at instant speed instead of just on equipment. I really love the card, and I love individual aspects of it. In the big picture sense, my goals for my cube right now are to cut down on the higher mana value cards and to cut down on cards that slow the game down or just drag it out. And in reality, I think what Batterskull does in my environment is a lot of the time it doesn't get played, because if you don't have Stoneforge Mystic, a 5-mana card is a big liability in an environment like mine. And so you're not likely to put a 5-mana creature that you can just dismember or whatever and then attack for lethal in your deck, because it's not that good. And if you do get Stoneforge Mystic, then it's kind of one of the best things you can be doing, and kind of falls into this very polarizing space that I don't necessarily love. And if you get to gain, 4, 8, 12 life off of it, that can really drag a game out and make it hard for tempo to matter in a particular game. So for all those reasons, the big picture goals, Batterskull doesn't really fit, even though I individually love that card, and so I got to come around to cutting it. But like I said, I'm not fraud about it, because if I change my mind and decide I want to put it back in, I'm just going to put it back in. I'm not getting rid of my Batterskull. I love my Batterskull. I'm going to put it in a nice little safe place, so if I decide to add it back in, I can just do that.
Yeah, and critically, you don't necessarily... Well, I appreciate that you're giving the context and the reasons why, and stating your design goals, because it's difficult just to say in a vacuum, well, I'm cutting this card because I don't like it anymore. But if you can say, this is why, this is the kind of gameplay it's creating that isn't supporting the experience that I want to have, that's really valuable context.
And is Batterskull one of the worst 20 cards in my cube? Probably not. I think when you have Stoneforge Mystic, it's one of the better cards in your whole pool. And when you don't, it's probably one of the worst cards in the cube. And that polarity is one of the things that I'm conscious of. I like cards that are differently powerful depending on what you've already drafted. But with Batterskull, it's really this very binary on-off, right? Mm-hmm. Batterskull doesn't get a little better if you have a more of certain type of things. It's either just quite good or pretty rough in my own environment. And that binary is not what I'm particularly interested in at this point.
Right. It's not like you're looking at the pack and you're like, well, I'll shift this up 2 or 3 cards if you want to think about ordering a pack that way in terms of my priorities. It's like all or nothing. This card either does the thing or is the absolute, I must have this for my deck to work.
Yeah, I would say the only interesting draft decision that Batterskull has added to lately is if you already have Stoneforge Mystic, do you try and wheel it is the question. And I think it depends a lot on how the draft has gone. If I think I'm one of the only drafters in white based on what's been going around the table, then I will maybe try and wheel it. If it's pack 3, I might try and wheel it. If it's pack 1...
Pack 1, other people are going to speculatively take half the combo.
If it's pack 1 and I've got Stoneforge Mystic pick 3 and then pick 5, here comes Batterskull, you bet I'm taking it. I'm not trying to wheel it then. So that's one of the only interesting decisions I think it's lent itself to. Otherwise, it's kind of did you do the combo? Great. If you didn't do the combo, then you're probably just putting that card in your sideboard and not playing it. All these things together mean that I'm cutting a card that I individually really like.
Another little example of this, I think, to think in the opposite direction is you can have cards that are maybe not quite meeting your design goals, potentially problematic. So I, for example, have Bolas's Citadel in my main cube, which is pretty low powered, and that card's kind of a bomb. But again, I think that volume really matters. In this environment, there aren't a ton of 6-mana black spells. There isn't a Grave Titan. There isn't the redundancy that you're building a deck consistently and often around playing these huge 6-mana bombs in this color. So I think just having it there as an outlier kind of just works fine. So I think that kind of volume aspect can cut both ways, where you can have cards that are less powerful but more impactful to the environment because they exist in a high volume, or cards that are maybe power outliers but because of their small volume still feel appropriate.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying there is that you don't have a deck that plays 5-mana rocks and, is trying to ramp out 6-mana cards, because Bolas's Citadel is one of the only ones. So there's not the other cards in the environment to support that. That's not a viable strategy. I don't know if Bolas's Citadel is actually that good in your cube. That might not be
the best example. I feel like Feather is an example we keep coming back to, but we've come back to that one a lot.
Yeah, I mean, Bolas's Citadel, it's a very cool card in terms of 6-mana cards, because it doesn't just win you the game. I mean, if there's an unanswered Grave Titan, you win the game in your environment, right? There's really nothing that can compete with a Grave Titan that doesn't get answered in terms of board impact and value. That'll run away with the game.
Yeah, that would be a problematic card.
Bolas's Citadel maybe doesn't win you the game. If you're already at a low life total, it might just be, some very paltry card selection for 6 mana, which is not fantastic. But I love that card and think it's worth kind of building your deck around, or trying to think about how to get into play and make it valuable.
I think this is my new card evaluation technique: is when the game is over, look at the winner's face and look at the loser's face. And when someone loses with Bolas's Citadel in play, they always have a smile on their face.
It's because they probably killed themselves, basically.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Similar to Ancient Tomb, I feel like. It's you're like, you know what? I did 16 to myself, so I guess fair. I had that coming.
We've all been there.
Fair play. Another tip I have is, again, in this vein of cuts not being final or critical to get right is I have often in the past just cut a card that is a very known quantity to me, where it's like, I know what this card does. It's not essential to any particular deck working. It just, greases the wheels of things. And I have a very clear sense in my head of how good this card is. So additional gameplay with it is not going to color my evaluation of it that much. Just cut that card, put in the new card you want to try out, and in time, you'll definitely find it somewhere you want to cut a card from the cube, and then you can always put that card that's a known quantity back in if you want to. My example of this on my own cube is, I think 4 times I have just cut Night's Whisper because I'm like, I know what this card does. It draws 2 cards in black. It's a very much a known quantity. I think it's good, but it's not like key to any particular deck functioning. It's not like I'm totally nerfing a specific deck by pulling this card out. So I'll just cut Night's Whisper, put in some more cards, and then inevitably, when the next round of cuts comes around, I'm like, actually, Night's Whisper's better than a couple of these cards, and I'm going to put it back in. And so it just kind of rides this like liminal zone where it's in and out of my cube. And this is the kind of thing you don't have to do if you're not maintaining a specific number of cards in the cube.
Ask, is this sort of your self-compromise with, you would just make the cube bigger and don't make cuts, take the advice you gave earlier, but you instead just sort of have this like overflow space where you have a set of cards that aren't actively there, but they're on deck.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that's what every cut is, right? There's this like liminal scale of how likely is this card to come back in the cube once it's been cut. And some of them are very unlikely. Some of them are very likely. Some of them are in between. And so for me, Night's Whisper, I intentionally cut it. And you can check my blog post history on Cube Cobra. I know I cut it a couple times before on Cube Tutor, before I moved over to Cube Cobra. But I even read when I cut it, I'm like, this is coming out for now because I don't want to cut anything else. And I know what this card does, and I can always add it back in. And then I always have. It's in my cube right now currently, and probably will be for a while until I need another cut maybe.
Maybe get bumped back into the overflow.
So that's a good alternative, I think, if you do, for whatever reason, like I do, want to maintain a rigid size of your cube. Maybe you just have a box that your cube fits in and you don't want to add more cards because it won't fit. That's a valid reason.
That is, I mean, my other restriction on my cube size is how much can I shuffle in a reasonable way?
Yeah. So whatever your reason is, if you do have a fixed number, I think that's a good way to approach it, is just if you're going to make a cut that you think is a temporary cut, or, putting something on the bench for a little bit to bring it back in later, just cut a card that's a known quantity, no matter how good it is, right? It's a known quantity and maybe not a key piece of any one deck, right? Like I wouldn't cut Wrath of God, even though it's a known quantity, because cutting one of my 4 Wraths is a big nerf to particular decks that are going to be seeking those board wipes.
Yeah, that's a really important sort of, really good example of where that kind of volume and context really matters and has a big impact.
Yeah, whereas, Night's Whisper, this card draw, I got card draw in most colors and at a decent density, and so it's not going to fundamentally change how a deck functions. So I'm going to swap that out for another card and then bring it back in if I want later.
So the last thing I think we should say somewhat explicitly is I think that cutting cards for being overpowered is just a very reasonable thing to do. I think often what can happen is you design a cube, you've got all kinds of cards that you really love and you want to see succeed and be impactful and be exciting. And it turns out that individual cards that are a little bit overpowered just end up taking over and dictating the games more than you want to, and just sort of working against your design goals. So I think it's totally reasonable to look at the cards that are a little bit overpowered that are being super impactful. And even though they're impactful and maybe players enjoyed winning with them, cutting them from the environment just to let other things that you want to focus on more really shine. I've experienced this a lot with my own cube, where initially that just was the case. A lot of the power outliers dictated the games, and the kind of draft experience, the kind of synergy, the kind of unique board states of things fitting together, that just wasn't really happening in a meaningful way. And over time, these were a lot of difficult cuts for me, because it's like, this is a card that I've included because I really like it. I like the way it's impactful, but it just isn't, it's not contributing to design goals because it is too impactful. So yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to approach things. Another way to think of it is like, if you're just making cuts from the bottom, you're slowly evolving your cube up in power level, you can do the same thing in the opposite direction. And essentially by cutting one overpowered card, you're kind of adding a bunch of those less powerful cards that used to end up in sideboards back to the cube and letting them be meaningful again. To give another really specific example, I love Slimefoot, I love Saprolings, and initially it just was really not a great card in my environment, but as I cut a lot of those higher powered cards, I ended up, I'm tying this all back together.
Yeah.
I ended up cutting Slimefoot, and then after years putting it back in, and it was just so exciting to see, like, yeah, this card it used to be a D minus, and now it's a C minus, and sometimes it ends up in decks.
I think it could be a C plus.
C plus
maybe.
in the right deck, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think you can draft around Slimefoot and make it happen. Yeah, I agree. I feel like maybe going through some more examples of cards we've cut for all these different reasons might be helpful. So you're talking about cutting from the top for just cards that are impactful but don't necessarily contribute to the play patterns you want big picture. A card I somewhat recently cut that I know was contentious for some was Duretti Ingenious Iconoclast, the 1 red black planeswalker that upticks to make a 1/1 defender artifact creature token and downticks to sacrifice an artifact to destroy a creature or artifact. And then it's got some ultimate. I think it makes copies of artifacts from your graveyard. It's never happened in my cube, but that's an ultimate there too. That's a card that is definitely very potent. I think it's very strong in my environment. It meets some set of my design goals in that it allows you to have lots of decisions to make, right? There are lots of decisions you get to make when you play Duretti around how you activate the loyalty abilities, how you use resources in play, whether you're trying to play towards an ultimate or whether you're trying to, just kind of build up defenses or whether you're actually trying to just go 1-for-1 on resources and whittle your opponent down. It's modal. It's relatively cheap in terms of mana cost. There's not many 3 mana value planeswalkers. I mean, there's a lot more now, but the cheaper planeswalkers are definitely ones I prefer over more expensive ones. But from another perspective, it was a card that it's a 3 mana planeswalker, which 3 mana is the top end of the curve for a lot of the decks in my cube, that doesn't win you the game ever. Except for getting some ultimate on a really powerful artifact creature or something, Duretti can literally never win you the game. All it can do is drag the game out. And so when the card is good, it's just turning the game into a grindy attrition-style match, which is not the kind of gameplay I overall want to encourage. So here's a card that is very potent. It fits some of my design goals, but not other ones. And I decided to cut it from the top. It's one of the better cards that was in my cube. I would say probably top 30 or something once it's in play. Gold cards are kind of hard to put on a ranking like that because I wouldn't take it that highly necessarily because it is harder to cast. But once you're in those colors, it's definitely one of the best cards you can get your hands on. But the overall way it was impacting the environment was against my sort of broader goals. So off the top it came. One more kind of similar in this vein is Courser of Krufix I cut from my cube 4 months ago. And this card I think is, again, very good. I think the card is powerful. I think it's perfectly reasonable in my environment. I don't think it's a liability to put it in your deck. But similarly to Duretti, it's another 3 mana card that is not very aggressive. It's a 2/4. It gains you life. It generates value in terms of drawing cards. And it's not something I felt like my green decks needed anymore. And because it was no longer necessary, I felt like, for the decks in my cube to have that kind of hard wall against aggro, this particular one card that was very difficult for aggro to deal with, short of a Flame Slasher or Dismember or something. Overall, it was, again, just not I've decided that at 3 mana, I really want my threats to be threats. And so a card like Courser of Krufix is not really a threat. It's a 2
power
card. If you're, up against it, you can either just, wait it out, or you can do something else to generate more card advantage than the Courser is giving its controller. It just doesn't make the games proactively proceed to an end state, which is something I've been prioritizing lately, even though the card is still quite good.
Yeah, that card's very powerful, very popular, and pretty contentious. You know what the hardest cuts I ever made from my cube were?
I don't know, random sapperlings?
Probably.
Your favorite combat tricks that everyone was dragging you for?
That's possible. It's possible. So you mentioned cards that you said you would never cut. I had a couple cards in my initial cube that I said I would never cut, which were Booster Tutor, especially, and Summon the Pack. And I absolutely adored these 2 cards. Both of them interact with sealed booster packs, and one lets you just put all the creatures from a booster pack into play for a bunch of mana. The other one just lets you tutor a single card from a booster pack. I thought these cards were so much fun. I still think they're so much fun. I think the biggest reason I cut them was partly for power level reasons. They were a little bit overpowered and, again, contributed to that experience of just, this is the only thing that matters in this game now, especially with Summon the Pack. The other reason was just logistical. Players did not enjoy the fact that it slowed down the gameplay. You had to go find a stack of cube cards and deal with it. So I think just also focusing on external factors about where are you playing your cube? What is the environment? You could even say, this card is too expensive, and I want to take my cube to the bar and play it on sticky tables. So I'm going to
says the guy that just cut his cycle of duels for a cycle of shock lands.
That's actually a really good example.
Cube.
I was glad I had enough shock lands so I could take my duels out of the turbo cube because I'm too much of a coward to take them to CubeCon.
I mean, that's totally fair, and also I think that in that particular environment, it is
not matter.
Literally irrelevant whether they are shock lands or dual lands. The life loss is not going to change anything in that particular environment.
Yeah. So those were difficult cuts. Another aspect of that is just that we had played those cards a lot. We'd had that experience. We'd done that. And there are diminishing margins on having the same experience in the game over and over again. So, yeah, after a while, even though I thought these are iconic, they are part of this, they're sort of define what this environment is about, but that kind of had to change and evolve so we could do something new and something else that was fun.
Summon the Pack is a really good case study of the texture of really powerful high mana value cards that I have been very conscious of in my own cubes as of late, which is that I think Summon Pack is 8 mana. Is it 7 and a black? It's a lot of mana.
That sounds right.
It's a lot of mana. It was probably the most expensive card in your cube in terms of mana value.
For
and
sure, yeah.
when you cast it, it might as well just say win the game, right? You're putting somewhere between 6 and 10 creatures in play of
at least 90% to win the game. It happened at least once that someone lost after resolving it.
That's surprising to me. They must have gotten really unlucky on their particular pack. I've played against some in the pack, and I oftentimes just concede before we do the logistics. It's like, all right, I mean, if you get 3 creatures, you're probably going to win, so I'm not going to make you go get a pack. I'm just going to concede, right? In which case, was Summon the Pack cool? No, it did nothing.
No, so you're right. Actually, what ruined this card was not the logistics. It was you. You just didn't. You refused to play it.
So I mean, I would play it if I got it in my pool and I had the right deck for it. But I think that's true of not just Summon the Pack, but many powerful cards. Which is that if they're really powerful and they're high mana value, which means they're not just relatively powerful, they're raw power level, right? Like if it's
Ugin the Spirit Dragon,
right? These cards so often just end the game, the turn, or the turn after they come into play, that it kind of doesn't even matter what they do, right? Like, your 8 mana card could be Ugin or it could be Summon the Pack. The game is just over either way. It doesn't really matter what the card does. And when you start thinking about it that way, it's like, well, what really is this card giving me then? If it's just kind of an interchangeable 8, or in my case, like a lot of my 6 mana cards, it was like if you could resolve a 6 mana card, you just won the game. It was Elspeth, Sun's Champion, it was Grave Titan, it was Inferno Titan. These cards would just win the game if they resolved. And when those cards all become essentially interchangeable and you're like, oh, I love the fact this has these cool abilities, the cool abilities just don't matter. It's just going to win the game when it resolves. And so I've found that forcing my players to try and win the game with cheaper spells, largely with threats that are not so, maybe are still powerful in terms of relative terms, or maybe it's a really good 3-drop, right? Maybe it's Lelia. Lelia doesn't end the game the turn she comes down. There is a window where you can interact with Lelia. It takes many turns for Lelia to get out of hand. It's a kind of card that the game continues to happen, right? And so because the game continues to happen, it matters that it's Lelia and not Goblin Rabblemaster or whatever, because those cards actually do have different effects and different abilities that change the texture of the gameplay, whereas it doesn't really matter if it's Ugin the Spirit Dragon or Summon the Pack or Grave Titan. The game's just over.
This is a whole deep topic, but I do think it does matter. The aesthetics ultimately do matter to games. And I think if we accept
that it's aesthetics, I will agree that it matters. But yes, it is aesthetic. It is not a game design.
Well, I think that is part of game
design. You're right.
But like I think we can see this perfectly executed in Planeswalker Ultimates. A lot of them do just say win the game, but importantly, they don't literally put those rules text because that would be very boring.
They do it sometimes.
Sometimes.
Chase Wheeler of Mystery says win the game on it.
He sure does.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most boring Planeswalker.
You're right. It does aesthetically matter because, like you said, if all these cards literally just said win the game, I think people will not be playing them because it's like, well, this is dumb, right? Mm-hmm. But they do functionally do that. And so the aesthetics are just that. They're aesthetics. They're not actually functional to how the game proceeds forward from that point. Anyway, that's a digression on Summon the Pack and other large threats, which I have just resolved. I don't know. I guess the other thing I decided when I cut a lot of my high mana value threats is I didn't want the game to resolve around individual cards. I didn't want the whole game to be about this card is so powerful that either you answer it and now you're way ahead because you got to just quench their Grave Titan, or you didn't answer it and now you're way behind. And I found that just relying on cheaper cards means that those cards are never going to have as much raw power level as the more expensive cards. And so there is more back and forth and less of this. It's more about two decks fighting each other rather than individual cards mattering. I can see on your face that you don't believe that about my environment. You're like,
no, I'm just thinking about, did you know Summon the Pack makes all the creatures zombies too? So if you have some cool zombie synergies, maybe you even got some zombies in that pack.
I believe that actually happened to me once, because you do have a zombie theme in your cube and have had it for a long time. And I'm pretty sure once somebody flipped a zombie lord and all the other creatures in the pack and was like, by the way, they're zombies. And I was like, I scoop. This game's over.
That's when you started scooping before opening the pack.
While we're talking about recent cuts that kind of fit this model, I did very recently bring back a card that I cut ages ago. Wolfbriar Elemental is that 4-drop that has multi-kicker green. You make as many wolf tokens as you pay green on top of its mana cost when you cast it. This was a card that I cut for what I admitted at the time was essentially kind of an interchangeable 4-drop. Like, they both had similar impact on the board, and they were both very powerful things that needed to be answered. They were both somewhat scalable. So like, and that slot has been used for a bunch of different cards over the years, right? Like I've just kind of, every time a new set comes out, I'm like, let's try the new green 4-drop. Let's try Questing Beast. Let's try Ulvenwald Oddity. Let's try some new Planeswalker. And I've just come back around to deciding that Wolfbriar Elemental is the one for me. It's just the right power level. It's the right flexibility, and it's the one I like the most. So that's a card that I cut probably, I don't know, a year and a half ago that I've decided to add back in because I think it just fits my goals better.
So just to counteract every point we've made, we talked about not necessarily cutting like-for-like cards, but there is also some value in cutting like-for-like cards when you just want to. It's not that you should
never do that. It's that I think a lot of players...
you shouldn't feel beholden to, but also...
Right.
It is an option, and sometimes you do just want to try little variations.
There are certainly some situations where that makes some sense, right? Like, I know density-wise, I want a certain number of, like, mid-rangey green threats. And so if I am cutting one of those to try another one, then it makes sense that I kind of have that figured out. I guess what I'm just saying is that it's not that you should never do those things that we said were common misconceptions or pitfalls. It's that I think a lot of players think you have to. And
right.
The majority of my cuts are not like for like. You can actually scroll through my blog pretty quickly because I've been pretty good about when it is a like-for-like cut, I'll actually do the swap in Cube Cobra. So you see the little swap icon. And when it's not, I just add and remove separately on different lines. And so you can actually scroll through and see how many cuts were, in my mind, like-for-like. And there's not many of them. But it does happen sometimes where I'm just like, you know what? Ulvenwald Oddity and Wolfbriar Elemental, like the actual impact on win rate, on gameplay is like pretty marginal. But there's just moments where I care about the abilities of Wolfbriar Elemental more, even if it's that long tail we've talked about so often, that like 5% of games where the difference is going to matter. In those games, I want people to have Wolfbriar Elemental instead of Ulvenwald Oddity. So there it is.
Same. I had Mana War in my cube. I swapped it for Baron, and Baron is a quote-unquote better card. It's more powerful. It has more options, but in the end, I just missed the Jellyfish. It's just nice. It's simple, and I love it. So Jellyfish came back. Get out of here,
Baron can't bounce himself, right?
That is true, yeah.
So he doesn't have more options.
Right, not strictly.
He has less options, but more stuff happens if you bounce some other stuff. Plus, he's double blue. I like Mana War over Baron. Well, you do have that kind of historic sub-theme.
There is. That's the one thing is Daniel drafted that ridiculous Legends Matter deck at one point.
Because I do really like, what's the blue-white legend that gives your Legends Flash? Wrath. I do like the idea of Wrath and Baron. That's cool. Pretty spicy.
Well, you know what? Every 4 months, we're just going to swap them back and forth.
Keep swapping them around. One other thing we haven't talked about is, I think sometimes there are cards that are perceived in dramatically different ways than they actually perform in the games because of maybe that card's performance in a different context or something. You might call this like a trap, right? Like a card that someone sees and assumes, oh, I can draft this kind of deck, but actually that deck isn't really supported in your environment. And an example for that for me is I ended up cutting Urza Lord High Artificer for a lot of similar reasons to everything else I've said, right? It's a 4-mana 1/4. It's not ending games very quickly. It's going to make the games very kind of sloggy and value-oriented. But also because I definitely don't support an artifacts deck in my cube. And a lot of players were seeing it and thinking, I'll draft the artifacts deck now. And I was just playing Urza as a like value 4-drop, right? Which people didn't see or expect. And that disparity in expectations and the actual performance of the card, I think, was causing some tension that I didn't like. So even though I think that card still good enough, and in some ways meets some of my play pattern goals. It wasn't worth the cost of that extra confusion that people were having sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, as always, what matters is players' experience, and if people are having a good time. And if there is a card like that you might say, yeah, this is a C+, it's fine, it doesn't need a lot of synergy because there isn't a lot to be had, but, take it appropriately in the pack. With that in mind, that would be fine. But because players were looking at it and saying, this is a A+ build around, I'm going to take this very highly. I'm going to miss the opportunity to take something that is potentially more impactful. And then later disappointed because they don't feel like they got that payoff and they feel like they wasted those decisions. That can be a negative experience. I think it's an experience that is easy to overstate and worry too much about creating these kinds of traps. But it can come up from time to time.
You do write on your Cube Cover blog, at least you write a little bit about each change, or do you just make cuts with no message?
Oh, I write long messages,
right?
Which is maybe part of the reason that it's been a while since I've updated.
That's definitely a barrier. It's definitely a barrier for me. Is I definitely, that's our unique position of we have a lot of people following our cubes. We have a podcast. I do kind of want this to be like a thing that I kind of batch things, and so I definitely have had changes in mind for a couple months that I could have just made, and if my cube wasn't so visible, I probably would have just made. But instead, I'm kind of building them up into a batch so I can write about them and have that be a thing.
I love to batch. I've got a little bit of a mess where it's I have some cubes where it's I know here's the stack of cards that I have cut, but I've left them in the box, so I know when I go update on Cube Cobra, I can do that. And, some spreadsheets with in-progress stuff. I'm all over the place over here.
Yeah, I think if you are especially new to cube design and finding making cuts difficult, I would definitely recommend scrolling through the blogs for both Anthony and my main cubes, which are linked in the show notes, and look at, maybe look at the notes. I'm not even look at the notes, though. Look at the cards that are cut and added in and see this in practice, right? See that the cuts and adds don't have to line up in terms of color or in terms of roll of the card, or in your case, even in terms of the number of cuts and additions. They could just be different numbers. It's totally fine. I think seeing that is a good way to let it really sink in that you can take this a lot less seriously. And actually, you're probably better off as a cube designer for it, the less seriously you take it, because the more you iterate, the more you're going to learn, and the more you're going to know when you're making card decisions to really craft the environment you want.
That is so true.
That will conclude this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. We got 15 weeks to CubeCon, Anthony. The number keeps going down. My excitement keeps going up. Can't wait for that event in Madison, Wisconsin. Check out mtgcubecon.com and mtgcubecon on Twitter for updates on that event. I know that tickets are going on sale in about 2 weeks. I don't know what it's going to cost yet, but I'm certainly getting ready to refresh my browser and buy those tickets as soon as they go online so that I can lock it in.
Yeah, I'm hoping we can get in. We drafted the Turbo Cube yesterday, and I'm hoping we can get a bunch more drafts in and not work out the kinks, but, maybe really get it fine-tuned so you all can have a great experience with it.
I think we could record maybe a whole episode just about last night's draft of the Turbo Cube and the conversation that has happened since. Because I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm sure you do too. Maybe next week. I don't know.
Okay. I do want to give another big thank you to listeners Talo and Donald K. Magic, who have continued to submit annotations for old episodes. These two awesome contributors are about a third of the way through, but if you would like to join them and help support the podcast, that project is still ongoing. We have some old episodes that we didn't annotate with all the cards we mentioned. So if you'd like to listen to some of those old episodes and help us out with that, check out the link in the show notes.
And Talo, Donald K. Magic, I'm not joking. If you're going to CubeCon, we will buy you dinner. We'll take you out for drinks. If you can't make it to CubeCon for whatever reason, I don't know, I'll send you some magic cards in the mail. I'm very grateful. I'm so grateful for you two for going through this back catalog. Just for my own compulsive wanting the show notes to all be consistent and correct, but also because I've been kind of imagining some cool visualizations of the cards mentioned on the podcast over time we could potentially graph out, and having holes in that data kind of takes the wind out of the sails of any cool ideas we could do with it. So really grateful for that. Thank you, Donald K. Magic and Talo. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. The show is produced by Anthony and I, thinking really hard about magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you, Andy.
I think with the Turbo Cube, you have to decide if you're just going to lean in and have everybody be doing degenerate stuff, which is totally valid. Like, there are definitely cubes where every deck is kind of the same deck or like a shade of the same deck, or if you really want to try and support this variation of like, you can do the degenerate thing, or you can do the control thing, or the stacks thing, or the aggro thing, and try and figure out how to make those things play together. But I think there's like a big crossroads you're at where you got to it's a fork in the road, and you can't really do both, I don't think. More on that maybe next week.
The way you've structured that question,
that wasn't
agree.
A question.
Every statement is a question. Every statement's just.
I was just sharing.
This is true.
I was just sharing a thought with you. Like, I think my combat trick cube is a good example of like every deck is kind of the same. There's still a lot of variety, but like I intentionally don't have a control deck in that cube, right, where it's just like got removal spells, because I think that kind of ruins the spirit of that environment. And I intentionally don't have like every deck's kind of an aggro deck, right? They're all pretty fast and have cheap threats. So I think there's like this distinction where either most of the cards in the cube are going to be playable by most of the decks, and you're kind of choosing a shade of a particular strategy or a color combination that maybe has a little bit of an identity. Or if you want these like really hard separations, right? Like my Hate Bears deck, I just couldn't take a lot of the cards that are otherwise good in the cube because I was literally playing all the cards that made those cards bad. And so they were bad in my deck if my deck was actually doing what it was supposed to do. I think there's more substantial changes that have to be made to try to make that actually be in balance. That sounds like a tough challenge to me.
I think also we have just like really crappy data. Like,
oh, of course,
we're
purely anecdotal.
We have great drafters, good players that are drafting this cube, but it's still like a tiny
even when it's at CubeCon, even if they draft it 100 times, it's still going to be bad data. That's not enough.
Yeah. So I'm still so curious. Like, I haven't seen somebody draft like the white-black hate bears. Like, there's really efficient hand hate in that environment, which maybe just doesn't matter because everybody ends up cycling their whole hand on turn one, and there's really
I'm
efficient
never going to
counter
play
magic.
like 3-mana Thought Seizes, which are 1-mana Thought Seizes in this environment, alongside Thalia. I'm just not going to do it.
Sure, maybe that's a bad example because I have actually, yeah.
Anyway, lots
These
to
are just
discuss there.
examples. There's a range of brutally efficient kinds of effects.
Lots to discuss.
Lots to think about.
Archon of Emeria. That's what I want. That's what you need more of in that Hate Bears deck if you want it to work.
And also win the die roll.
Got to win the die roll. Got to win the die rolls. The Hate Bears deck critical to your success.
That is the big problem.